Kia ora everyone, that's 1:30 by my clock, so thank you all for joining us on this Friday afternoon. It's great to have you here at today's open Zoom session on our path to 2035. Called Charlie Keeling Aho. I'm a senior advisor in the communications and engagement team, and I'll be taking us through this session today. But first, we have Bevan Hunter, principal advisor in our corporate services team, who's been working on our internal capability here at the Commission. We're really happy to have Bevan lead us into the session with a karakia. Kia ora, Bevan.
Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, I runga I te pāka whakata reo nei, a tēnā tātou, anei he karakia. Poipoia te Māori, poipoia te Wairua, poipoia te tapu, poipoia te whenua o Papa Tuanuku. For those of us who speak English, that's nurture the life force, nurture the spirit, nurture the sacredness, nurture the lands of Mother Earth. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Bevan, thank you. So before I tell you a bit more about what we've been up to at the Commission, it'd be great if you could please write your name and the organisation or community you represent in the chat while I'm talking, and let us know where you're joining from in Aotearoa. And those of you who've been on most of these sessions will be familiar with this, but it's just great to see who we've got participating since we can't see all of your faces. And while you're doing that, I'll give you a quick update. As you're all likely aware from the last few weeks of engagements, we released our draft advice outlining what Aotearoa could do to reach its climate targets on the 31st of January. And at 9 a.m. on the 1st of February, consultation on our draft advice opened to the public. So until the 14th of March, we really would love you to make a submission and tell us what you think about our mahi. I'll post a link to our consultation page in the chat at the end of this session. It's really important to remember we're open to changing our advice depending on what we hear during consultation. So we're really keen to hear from you and are looking forward to finding out your thoughts. Today you'll be hearing from our expert team, Principal Analyst Chris Holland and Senior Analyst Paul Young. They'll be taking us through our recommended path to 2035, looking at why we've chosen that path and our approach, as well as looking at what this means in different sectors. This time we're going to run things a bit differently to previous sessions. We're going to run through the whole presentation for the first half, and then the second half will be for questions. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions, and we'll keep an eye on those coming through. Unfortunately, we won't have time to answer all the questions on the call, so if you could ensure they're not too technical, that would be really great. And as always, if you want to speak to each other or share your thoughts, we encourage you to use the chat. So that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Chris, who'll be kicking us off. And thank you, Amy, for driving the slides for us.
Cool. Thanks, Charlie. So, kia ora, everybody. Ko Chris Holland aho. I'm in the modelling team here at the Commission. I'm just going to take over the slides. So we're going to spend about 25 minutes or so talking you through the pathway that we've built, which is kind of underpins our advice around the budgets to 2035. We're going to throw a lot of graphs at you and a lot of numbers, but we're really happy in the Q&A to kind of unpack all those and talk through what they mean. This is really just around the kind of the technical ideas behind the path and not really getting into the policy, but we can talk about that if people have questions. What we want to talk through first is that path to 2035. And I think before we even get going, it's worth to say that this is a path to 2035, and there are going to be multiple paths in reality. There's going to be a range of things we can do over the next 14 years to 2035 to reduce emissions. And in our modelling, we've made some assumptions around how fast things might change. I fully expect we're going to be wrong on some of those things. Some things might move more quickly, some things more slowly. But I think it'll give you a sense around the kinds of change we'd expect to see needed in Aotearoa in order to meet those budgets, and an idea about the kind of things which are critical to achieving it. So let me first start by making sure the slides work. So just a little bit first about our approach to how we've met the 2050 target and how we've gone about our analysis. So we started our analysis first by looking at what are the actions that can reduce emissions in Aotearoa? So what are the technologies, the mitigations, the behaviours which can help reduce emissions? And that helped us build a set of long-term scenarios, which I'll talk through some of the results of today, which look at how those choices could change over the next 30 years, and also how we could respond to different scenarios. So that's kind of exploring things like how fast technology changes or how fast behaviors change, what could the world look like in 30 years' time, and then kind of what's the actions that we could use to help meet our 2050 targets. From those 2050 targets, kind of looking at 2050 and then working back to what that means for 2035, we built a path to 2035, really building up from today about what's kind of feasible with today's technologies, and what are, understanding that uncertainty around where eventually we might need to get to, what are the kind of actions we think today would be useful in any of those futures. We were then able to look at the potential impacts of that path, and then to look at the policies which might be needed to put us on those paths. And then we went through a process of testing and refining and iterating between those to understand that the path is feasible with meeting the 2050 targets, that the impacts are manageable, and that there are policies that it's possible to put in place to actually deliver those emissions reductions. And the advice that I'm going to talk around today is really around the level of the first 3 emissions budgets, and to a certain extent the direction of the emissions reduction plan which falls out of that. We've given separate advice around the level of biological methane that might eventually be required, and around the consistency of our first NDC with the 1.5 degree goal, but I don't really want to talk about those today. This is really just around the level of the budgets and how we've used the past to help inform that. Okay, so just a quick recap of where our emissions are today. So the Act breaks down the targets for emissions in 2050 into 2 components. So the first is around long-lived gases. So that's mainly carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, and there's a few other funky little gases in there that we have to think about as well. But really, carbon dioxide is coming from fossil fuel use, really coming from transport and in the heat, energy and power sector. So that's from oil, gas and coal. There's also long-lived gases of nitrous oxide which come from agriculture. So you can see there's about kind of 8 megatons of carbon dioxide. There's some other long-lived gases coming from waste, and also from F-gases which are used as refrigerants. On the biogenic methane side, the majority of the biogenic methane is coming from agriculture, and around 10% is coming from waste. And the reason the Act splits these out is because they have very different properties in the atmosphere. So long-lived gases tend to accumulate over hundreds or thousands of years and don't break down in the atmosphere, and have a kind of long life in the atmosphere, versus methane from biological sources, which creates warming in the short run but breaks down relatively quickly. And so the Act sets different targets for those. So for long-lived gases, it sets a net zero target by 2050. So net zero meaning kind of net of forestry as well. So the gross emissions can be offset by forestry. And for biogenic methane, it sets a target of 10% reduction by 2030 and a range of between 24 and 47 by 2050. So throughout the rest of this presentation, we're going to talk about those 2 sets of gases separately, and that's how we conducted our analysis. So just to let you know. So let's start with what we found on our path for long-lived gases. So this is a projection of what would happen under current policy if we didn't do anything to adjust current policies over the next 30 years. So it's a hypothetical case, and it's not kind of intended to reflect what we think the government would or should do. But it gives us a baseline to understand, how big is the emissions reductions that we need to make in order to put ourselves on track. So in this, we've kept constant the emissions price for all sectors. So that's a $35 emissions price held constant out to 2050. And you can see that's the dark black line there on your screen shows what the net emissions are. And you can see those emissions decline from around 40 megatons now to around about 10 megatons by 2050 in this baseline. What's striking though is that a lot of that net emissions reduction is coming from additional forestry removal. That's forests planted in the next 10 years or so, which are removing carbon from the atmosphere. We are seeing some emissions reductions of gross emissions. So you'll see that the kind of pink area from heat, industry and power is declining slightly. And that's because we've assumed in our modelling the closure of aluminium and methanol productions in the 2020s. And we've got a little bit of renewable electricity coming on there as well, pushing out things like gas. We've also got emissions from the transport sectors declining, and that's because there's an adoption of electric vehicles, even without any higher emissions price or other incentives, because those vehicles have a lower overall cost of ownership and use. We're expecting people to be adopting them anyway, but the rate of adoption is quite slow in this. So you'll see by 2050, we're not too far away from meeting our 2050 target, but it's more about the story around how we're choosing to meet it. So this is really a story about not really reducing our gross emissions, and instead, planting further forests to reduce it and get to that target. So then we looked at what happens if we modify those current policies. So thinking particularly about the ETS and the emissions price that we see in the economy. So this is an alternative kind of current policy where what we've done is put a higher emissions price on there. So now we're looking at a $50 emissions price, which is fairly modest. But what that's done, I don't know if you can tell, that hasn't actually really reduced gross emissions. But what it's done is encouraged more forests to be planted. And you can see that we've reached net zero by 2050, but our gross emissions in 2050 are really kind of unchanged. And if we play that out beyond 2050, you can see that if we stop planting trees in 2050, what happens is our emissions, our net emissions quickly bounce back up to above zero. So this is a kind of case of meeting net zero in 2050, but then failing to put ourselves on a path which is consistent with maintaining that trajectory beyond 2050. So with that in mind, we thought about the path that we want to set in advising on the emissions budgets and how we choose to meet our 2050 targets. So it's obvious from that analysis that extending current policies would do very little to reduce gross emissions, but instead would meet the 2050 target through just additional forestry. So we set out in our advice a set of principles for how we advise on this. And I've drawn out the three which were most important in guiding our thinking on the approach to meeting the 2050 target. So the first is around focusing on decarbonising the economy. So this is really that Aotearoa should prioritise the actions that reduce gross emissions within our borders. Relying too heavily on forestry before 2050 is likely to make maintaining net zero after 2050 challenging, as we just saw from that graph. So it could delay necessary actions, lead to higher cumulative emissions, and put the burden of addressing gross emissions onto future generations. The second principle we applied was really around creating options. So there's value in creating options for how we can meet the target and being able to adjust the course of the transition as it proceeds. But that needs to be balanced with the need to take advantage of key windows of opportunity, where making significant investments now could ultimately make the transition faster and cheaper. And thirdly, around avoiding unnecessary costs. So this means using measures with lower costs wherever possible, and planning ahead so that assets and infrastructure can be replaced on as natural a cycle as possible. Well, that means we need to stop investing now in assets which are not compatible with that long-term objective and that long-term target. So drawing on those principles, we kind of recommend two key transformations to meet the 2050 target. So the first is decarbonising the sources of long-lived gases wherever that's feasible. To put simply, that's planning to transition away from fossil fuel use wherever there are feasible alternatives. This includes low and medium temperature process heat, electricity generation, energy use in buildings and land transport. And secondly, building a long-term sink for carbon through establishing new native forests. So these forests, if established on less productive land, could create that long-term sink to remove carbon from the atmosphere. That allows us to meet the 2050 net zero target and maintain it without having to have further land use change. So it's also important to say that new native forests also provide a wide range of co-benefits. So alongside sequestering carbon, they also prevent erosion, improve water quality, and support biodiversity. So there's a lot of positive things to be gained through establishing new native forests. So just looking at kind of what that transition would look like and how it looks differently, the next slide just talks around what those two key transformations would look like. So you can see there, we've really pushed hard to reduce transport emissions and emissions from the heat industry and power sectors. We've still got some long-lived gases from heat industry and power, and that's really from industrial processes where it's very difficult to remove those emissions entirely. So perhaps from the process themselves. So I'm thinking really around steel manufacture or cement. We've also still got those long-lived agricultural gases, so the nitrous oxide. That's reduced a little bit in this pathway because we're also assuming a kind of reduction in the number of animals. But you can see in this scenario, we've reduced gross emissions significantly. And because we've done so, we've able to meet and exceed a net zero target by 2050. If we play this out beyond 2050, you'll see that those sources of gross emissions don't really decline, and that's purely because we don't have any evidence around what those mitigations could be there. You can see that we still get a return where our net emissions start to trend back up, but it's much more shallow than in the previous case. And so that would kind of mean that we could much more easily sustain net zero emissions beyond 2050 in this scenario. Now, it's possible that there are other things we could do to help keep us below net zero. So that could be planting a small amount of additional forestry, or that could be looking for further ways to reduce emissions in those kind of remaining sectors. Or it could be looking to do alternatives like bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, which could offset some of those emissions without further land use change. We've not made recommendations about those in our report, but there are all kind of possibilities, looking out beyond 2050. So the other thing that I suppose I should mention here is, that little dotted line there is looking at kind of what happens if we plant an additional 5,000 hectares a year. So, rather than looking at large-scale land use change beyond 2050, we're looking at something which is much more modest, but we have alternatives if we need it. So looking at the path we've recommended to 2035 and the range of uncertainty. So building those ideas around reducing gross emissions as far as possible and building an enduring sink of carbon removals. We built a range of scenarios out to 2050, and you can see that kind of shaded range out shows kind of what those scenarios look like. We've based the path that we've recommended towards the more ambitious range of that area. And that really reflects, for long-term gases, this is really a story about how quickly we can choose to adopt a number of technologies which are already commercially available, but need to be encouraged to reach their maximum adoption. This is really around a fuel switching story for heat and process heat in particular, so we're switching away from coal and towards biomass and electricity, and also the adoption of electric vehicles. So we feel that the path we should be taking now should put us on an ambitious path to allow us to maximize and exploit those opportunities which are already available today. So I'll talk through now what that pathway looks like for each of the sectors in 2035. So this slide breaks down our emissions in 2035, building it up from where we are today. So current emissions of long-lived gases are 45.7 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. under current policies, we see emissions reductions by 2035 of about 6 megatons. That's from a combination of factors, including that assumed reduction in emissions from aluminium and methanol production, and also some switching to more renewable sources of electricity generation. So our gross emissions reduced by those 6 megatons. In addition, we get 12 megatons of carbon removals from those forests which are planted out in the next 10 years. So they're starting to sequester quite a lot of emissions. So we get to 27 megatons of emissions by 2035 under current policies, but our pathway goes further in a number of areas. Firstly, on transport, our path sees fast reduction of electric vehicles for cars, vans, utes, SUVs and buses. So all new light vehicles entering the fleet will need to be electric before 2035. But even so, around 6% of the light vehicles on the road in 2035 will still be petrol and diesel. There's also some emission savings coming from trying to reduce the demand for private car use. So by improving the alternatives such as walking, cycling and public transport, and also encouraging other things which reduce transport demand like remote working. At the same time, while we're still importing petrol and diesel vehicles, there are emissions reductions to be had from encouraging the importation of more efficient ICE vehicles over the next 15 years or so. By 2035, we'll also have to start the transition to decarbonize medium and heavy trucks. So we've modeled this as a story around electrification. You know, there's an alternative path there for hydrogen, and we're really interested if there's evidence around what that might cost and what the implications might be. You know, it's unlike for cars, the path for heavy trucks is much more uncertain around whether it's going to be a hydrogen story or an EV story. But we've modelled that as electricity for our purposes here. Moving on to the heat industry and power sectors. So alongside efficiency improvements, we can start to reduce the fossil fuel use in buildings for heating, hot water and cooking. So commercial and public buildings can relatively quickly transition away from using coal to biomass, where this could use existing boilers. Our path also looks to avoid new heating systems being scrapped before the end of their useful life, which is typically 20 years or more. This means that all new space heating and hot water systems installed after 2025 must either be electric or biomass if we're all going to be on track to eliminate those emissions entirely by 2050. The electrification of transport and energy use in buildings can also be supported by increased renewable electricity generation. So this in our pathway to 2035 is mainly a story around increasing use of wind and geothermal, but there's also some solar generation coming on towards the end of that period. In manufacturing, many sites that use coal at the moment for process heat, particularly in food manufacturing, can switch relatively quickly to using biomass where that's locally available, or electricity where it's not. And what we're looking for is a transition away from using coal in those for those sectors by about 2037, and then later beyond the budget periods, looking to kind of transition away from using gas. Moving on to agriculture. So there's some reduction in the long life gases here, the nitrous oxide, coming from, in our modelling, an assumed reduction in livestock numbers, which I'll talk a bit more in a minute. And for F-gases, so as I mentioned, these are primarily used as refrigerants. So the emissions reductions here are coming from better use and recovery of these gases when products like air conditioners or refrigerators come to the end of their use and their natural life, and being better management of those. So we get further reductions in emissions from forestry. So this is primarily from starting to establish those slow-growing native forests. So you can see the emissions reductions from forests here are relatively small compared with the plantation forests assumed in the baseline. but remember that these forests will continue to sequester carbon for decades to come. So this is much more kind of enduring sink. So that gets our kind of total net emissions down to 13 megatons by 2035. So I'm going to quickly talk through the story for biogenic methane on the same lines. Let me just get my notes in front of me. So for biogenic methane, the story is slightly different because what we've got is a bit more uncertainty around the technologies that could help support those emissions reductions and how quickly they could be adopted. So you can see here a graph which shows our scenarios out to 2050. It also shows the current policy reference. So you can see there's a declining emissions from biogenic methane out to 2050. And in part, that's driven by assumed land use change in the baseline, switching away from sheep and beef to other land uses, including horticulture and forestry, and also some kind of reductions in stock numbers, which are assumed in response to the latest freshwater management changes. But what we've tested is a range of scenarios where technology and behaviour could change differently. So under the headwinds scenario, we see relatively modest technology improvements that could allow farmers to improve their performance, and relatively slow adoption of those technologies and practices which are available today. In that scenario, we don't see any methane inhibitors or methane vaccines which are not commercially available today. And so under that scenario, we would still be able to reach the 2050 target without those technologies. But we'd be really pushing hard on the changes in practice that farmers can make today to reduce emissions. You can see both the further technology and tailwind scenarios, those bottom two scenarios. The emissions there's quite a big reduction in emissions, and that's because those assume that technologies which break the link between feed input to animals and the amount of methane created become available sometime in the 2030s. And so those are the methane inhibitors and vaccines which are being researched today. There's a lot of uncertainty about those, about kind of when they might be available, how effective they might be, what they might cost, and whether there are any kind of market implications of their use. But it's interesting to see that if those were available and were widely adopted, we'd be able to meet and exceed that more ambitious end of the 24 to 47% reduction by 2050. But of course, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty around when those actually are available. So thinking about setting our budgets with that context in mind, you can see here I've kind of copied over the range for the scenarios. The budgets we're recommending for biogenic methane and the pathway we're recommending pushes hard on the actions that farmers can take today to reduce emissions. And so those are things which generally improve on-farm performance and either maintain or improve productivity while reducing emissions, but hasn't relied yet on methane inhibitors or vaccines which are not yet commercially available. So you can see we've kind of set a path which we are confident will put us on track to meet towards the top end of that range, the 24% reduction. And I think we will, when we come back to give further advice around setting the next budgets in 4 years' time, we can reassess whether we feel that that is the appropriate way to deal with this, or whether we should be more ambitious. We also make recommendations in our advice around the need to encourage and support the emissions reductions, potential of those technologies through research and development. So it's definitely part of the story, but we're not banking on it in order to meet our path to 2035. So just let me talk through what the changes might look like for biogenic methane and what we're doing there. So again, this slide looks at the picture for 2035. So emissions in 2035 of methane themselves, so we're 1.32 megatons. So this is not carbon dioxide equivalent, this is megatons of methane, which is a slightly unusual unit. under current policies, as I mentioned, some land use change and some reductions in stock mean that there's a reduction in biogenic methane of around kind of, I think it's 7% by 2030. And that's looking at a kind of 8 to 10% reduction in stock numbers by 2030 is what has been modelled there. This again is due to the freshwater reform, some land use change, and farmers adopting technology improvements which are already available. Our path goes further by really pushing hard on those changes which farmers can make today to improve their productivity. So this can often mean farmers farming fewer animals, but each animal being more productive. So the story for overall production is that you can reduce emissions by having fewer animals, but maintaining the same quantity of milk and meat production as we do today. The other thing which comes into our path by 2035 is low emissions breeding for sheep. So this is selectively breeding for those sheep which are have the lowest emissions traits. So that's a proven technology which farmers can start to adopt from today, but will take time for those genetic traits to cycle through the whole national flock. For methane from waste, this is a story really around reducing waste emissions at source where possible. So reducing the amount of organic waste such as food, paper and wood which are produced, and then better management of those wastes. So avoiding those wastes going to landfill where there's an alternative such as anaerobic digestion or composting, or where it does go to landfill, making sure that that landfill gas capture system is effective as possible, and that all sites are using landfill gas capture where it's feasible. So that's a really whirlwind tour through our path. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Paul, who's going to talk through pathways involved for each sector. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm called Paul Young. Aho. Am I driving here? No, I'm not. Am I gonna, no, okay. On autopilot here. Okay, so yeah, I hope you've got an appetite for a few more charts, because there's plenty more where those came from. And Chris has already covered a lot of the detail, so I'll try and be pretty brief here. I know there are a lot of questions coming through. So next slide, please, Amy. So yeah, I'm going to talk through just a little bit of what our path involves for each sector, some of the insights and a bit more of the trends and data there. So this, looking at transport first, our pathway gets where it does through sort of a combination of two things in particular, and that's reducing road vehicle travel and then electrifying our transport system. And so on the first point, this chart here, which all of these charts you can find in our reports, is showing the impact of that on the total amount of household light vehicle travel. So moving from the dark blue line, which is our reference case, and then down to what's in our path. So pretty significant reductions, so that we're actually reducing the total amount of light vehicle travel by 2035. And you can see there the impact of reduced travel demand, which we're assuming can happen through things like encouraging more compact urban form and encouraging a continuation of more remote working and avoiding travel there. And then we're also assuming some pretty big changes around how we travel. And so, for example, cycling and public transport more than doubling by 2030 and more than tripling by 2035. And obviously that will require a lot of making it easier for people to adopt those modes for that sort of thing to happen. Next slide, please. So the other piece of the puzzle, electrification. And this is what we really need to do, this to be able to eliminate the emissions from the transport system in the long run. And so this chart here is showing the uptake of electric vehicles into our fleet, and the green line here is the vehicles that are entering the fleet, just for light vehicles here, not heavy. And as you can see, our pathway is about trying to get to sort of be no longer importing internal combustion engine vehicles by 2032, and there is an inertia in the vehicle system that means it'll take time from then to actually turn the fleet over and for all the vehicles on the road to be electric. But we are getting to a point by 2035 when around half of all the vehicle travel by light vehicles would be electric, on the way to virtually all of it by 2050. Next slide, please, Amy. So in buildings, it's really about reducing coal and gas use. Coal, as you can see in the chart there, is already pretty small, but it's still there and can be eliminated pretty quickly. Now, how we do this is through a combination of efficiency and then changing the sources of the fuels. So for gas, we're looking at, I guess, an objective of trying to basically decarbonize our buildings by 2050. So that's our space and water heating, bit of cooking as well. And the pathway we've designed is about a steady transition towards that goal. And that means starting really early to not be making the problem worse and not installing new fossil heating systems. And then a steady sort of conversion over time as much as we can stick to the sort of natural capital replacement cycle for those existing gas systems. And as I've said, efficiency plays an important role here too, particularly in new builds and improving the efficiency in commercial buildings. Next slide, please. It's a pretty similar story around industrial heat. So this is looking at, in particular, at the food processing sector, this chart. There's a lot more coal use here than there is in buildings, and that is really, a priority to be reducing because it's so emissions intensive. So we've got a similar story, I guess, around, efficiency and fuel switching, but here biomass we see playing a really important role. Our analysis suggests biomass is the least cost option where it's practical to switch to that for this medium temperature heat. There's a bit of that already happening, and our pathway is pretty ambitious around the pace at which we can convert the existing coal boiler fleets to biomass. So basically involves the equivalent of about one pretty large dairy plant conversion, like the Te Awamutu plant that converted last year, to basically that happening every year. We do see a bit of gas fuel switching occurring after 2030, probably not so much before then, but again, efficiency is starting to ease into those emissions. And we do see, some still significant electrification happening where the biomass supply is constrained in some regions. Next slide, please. So underlying all of this, some of these changes we've seen is a significant expansion of our electricity system, and at the same time as reducing the emissions from the electricity system. So this chart here is showing the change. The breakdown of electricity demand by some of the broad sectors, and you can see there the transport electrification really taking off, as well as the other industry adding a lot as well. That's the process heat fuel switching we've talked about. We've assumed in our path that the Tiwai aluminium smelter closes in 2024. And so that isn't our baseline. It is not just part of our pathway. It's what we're assuming will happen anyway here. And as you can see, and as probably everyone's aware, that's a significant component of New Zealand's current electricity demand that would go away, but we are getting, pretty rapidly, the demand growth would see us back where we are. Next slide, please. So overall, this chart is showing the changes in annual generation from different sources. And what we're seeing overall, and certainly over the long term, is this need for continued significant building of renewable generation. In the short term, we expect there to be, but that is happening anyway. There are a lot of plants under construction. And so our short-term forecast is really largely based on that as well. And that will be reducing the baseload gas emissions that we currently have in the system. There's a bit of a pause as the smelter dynamic plays out, and then it's sort of, we've got a ramp up over time. We were basically building the equivalent of about 3 west wind farms. That's in Wellington per year. And as Chris mentioned, solar starts to play a role later on as due to the changes in costs. Now, it's worth saying, I guess, the precise grid mix is less important to the emissions outcomes, but New Zealand is lucky to have a number of low emission sources of future generation. Next slide, please, Amy. Okay, there's a few things for you to click here. So I want to just walk through, Chris has talked about this, how we've approached the agriculture sector in our path and relying heavily on existing changes we can make in farm practices and no sort of non-commercially available technologies. So I just want to walk through some of the trends we're seeing. Could you do a few, 3 clicks? Okay, so for the dairy sector, I guess what we've seen in the past is we've seen growth in stock numbers, we've seen milk solids per animal going up, and we've seen a very significant increase in production. And what we're seeing in our path is a continuation of those productivity gains, but with stock numbers actually falling, keeping production at a similar level as today. And then if you click a couple more times, we're also seeing an improvement in the historic trend of improving emissions intensity. And when you combine those things together, we can achieve some pretty significant reductions in our total methane emissions. And if you just click through the next chart, Amy, you can click right through. We're seeing, there are some things in common with sheep and beef, except historically the trend around sort of the land use and the number of stock for sheep and beef that's been falling. So we've already been in this situation where basically productivity improvements have been maintaining production from fewer animals, and our pathway assumes that can continue to happen through the kind of changes we're talking about. Okay, next slide, please. New planting area, that's the afforestation, and also the deforestation, that's the shaded area underneath. And as you've heard, our path is much, focuses on significantly on native afforestation in a way that would be quite unprecedented. The exotic afforestation plays an important role out to 2030, and then we see that start to ramping down our reliance on that in order to meet the 2050 target. And I think one more slide. So waste, as Chris has said, we're looking at reducing the ultimate source of the emissions, which is putting waste into landfills, organic waste. And there are a range of diversion options shown here in this chart, which all play a role: recycling, composting, anaerobic digestion, and using wood for boiler fuel. And then not shown here is improving the landfill gas capture at landfills, which also is an important part of how New Zealand's reduced waste methane emissions to date, and something we think more can be done. So that's it from me. Thanks for your attention, and look forward to getting on to the questions now.
Thanks, Paul and Chris, that was great. We've got 15 minutes for questions, so I'll try and whiz through as many as I can in that time. So I'll start off with this one. Are you anticipating making any recommendations about strategies for monitoring and measuring our progress to meeting the proposed pathway? If yes, do you have a sense of key elements of such strategies, including the frequency of measures needed to be able to inform pathways and policy reviews and adjustments?
Yeah, I can pick that one up. So, so once we give our advice to the government on the level of the emissions budgets, the Commission's role is to monitor each year progress towards meeting them. And so in our report, in a number of areas, we've set out a number of progress indicators, and which kind of are allow us to say where we will be holding government to account to assess whether they're on track to meet the budgets that we've recommended. In a number of our recommendations around specific policies, we've also recommended deadlines for when policy should be put in place or considered. So it's definitely been at the front of our minds, making sure that the progress we start now has to start quickly. So it's definitely thinking about reviewing this pathway and making sure that we're on track to meet it is definitely in the front of our mind.
Thanks, Chris. We've got another one here. How sensitive are your results? For example, if TY Point is not closed, what difference does that make? If hydrogen technology does not advance as we'd hoped, or if take-up of EV cars is much quicker, etc.?
Yeah, I might throw to Paul in a second, but we've looked at different pathways which could meet the overall level of budgets which we've recommended. And there's some flexibility there that if all the technologies we've anticipated and all the behaviour changes we've assumed don't pan out, that other measures could be brought on to keep us on that path. Around things like hydrogen, that's a really interesting area because that is moving relatively quickly. So through this consultation, we've become aware that a number of kind of companies are starting to explore that quite actively, which is something we're kind of thinking about. How do we factor that into our analysis? Paul, do you want to talk a little bit more about how we've thought about that uncertainty?
Yeah, so as Chris mentioned, we did a few sort of variations on our main pathway to show, to ourselves that there's some flexibility in how those budget numbers can be met, and we discussed that in a little bit of detail in the evidence report, chapter 9, I believe, towards the end. So that's looking at underachieving in one area, can that be made up by going harder in another area? For example, if the EV uptake is a bit slower than we've assumed, then can we push some of the behaviour change side a bit further? And so through that process, we're happy that there's enough sort of resilience around that pathway. Some of the sensitivities is something we want to draw out a bit more for our final advice, like the timing of the exit of the aluminium smelter. But again, we think that is something that can be handled within the sort of flexibility of the different options that we have for reducing emissions. So it would make, if it stayed longer, it would make it harder to meet the budgets, but not impossible.
Thanks both, that was great. So we've had a couple of questions about our current policy reference earlier on, so I'll just ask both of those now and throw them out. What is the basis for assuming that current policy, i.e. doing nothing scenario, will track downwards? Is it not all due to EVs? And the second one was, for the current policy settings, what would happen if emissions pricing escalated up towards levels suggested by the Climate Change Commission modelling?
Yeah, so we so on the first one around what's tracking down in those emissions. So it is partly an EV story. As those EVs come on, that helps to reduce emissions. But it's also, as we were just mentioning, the assumed closure of methanol and aluminium production in the 2020s, which is contributing to that kind of reduction in gross emissions. But what's really interesting is at the prices we're looking at for the current policy reference, there's very little abatement in things like the heat industry and power sectors to transition away from fossil fuel use, like coal use particularly. So that would need emissions prices much higher than $50 a tonne, for instance. Yeah, on your second point around what would happen if we just adjusted policies, yeah, I think that's really around that you know, if we took a single incentive, a single price for both emissions reductions and emissions removals, we get to a stage where there's a lot of potential for emissions reductions removals from forestry, but we don't really solve the problem by 2050. We've kind of kicked the can down the road if we just have an emissions price like that, and it's unlikely to encourage the kind of transition we need to sustain net zero long term.
Thank you, Chris. We've got on here, why have you ruled out further generations bearing costs? They are beneficiaries of both the growth and the process of reduced emissions.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So I wouldn't say that we've ruled out further generations, future generations bearing cost, but I think what we're suggesting is that those future generations will also be dealing with the fact that they're going to have to be adapting to climate change, physical impacts of climate change at the same time. And what we want to do is, you know, and it's a value judgment really, that we want to be giving those future generations, bequeathing them a set of choices with some flexibility, and that if we achieve that 2050 target by just planting forests, then what we'd have done is not really solve the problem, and we'd have reduced their choices because we would have locked up a lot of land into exotic plantation forests. I think the other thing that's worth noting that probably doesn't come through in our analysis is that a lot of the measures that we're looking to encourage also have a lot of co-benefits, which accrue not just to future generations but to current generations. So that's things like improved air quality or water quality, but also many measures such as kind of adopting EVs we think are going to be lower cost overall. So that benefits future generations, but it also benefits us as well when we start to adopt them.
Thank you. We've probably got time for a couple more. So planting most of the land for native afforestation with exotics initially and then transitioning to native from there, with or without exotic harvest, would absorb far more CO2. Did you explore this option?
Yeah, so that's definitely something that's been in the mix of our thinking about different kind of management regimes for forestry. I think that's a question is probably best to put to our kind of forestry lead, who's Phil Wiles. But what was interesting is, you know, and I think something we need a bit more evidence on is around the kind of risk profiles of different forestry types. So one of the arguments I hear is that you know, having a diverse range of native species is more resilient to kind of potential future risks around climate change, such as kind of wind events or fires or pests, than a kind of all your eggs in one basket, you know, Pinus radiata. So it's a really interesting question around kind of what you do there. There's been some evidence, I think, on, you know, planting pines first and then letting native trees regenerate after. But as a, you know, what I've heard is that that's kind of really at early stages and hasn't really been proven. So I suppose, you know, for some land that we're planning to plant in natives, that wouldn't be suitable for pine anyway. But it's a really interesting point, and we're really happy to take kind of submissions on that if there's evidence.
Thanks, Chris. I'll just ask one more. So with regards to changing the vehicle fleet to electric, do the emissions benefits also include the net difference in manufacturing and disposing of these new EVs compared with internal combustion, or is it purely the driving part of the emissions that is considered? Yeah.
So we've kind of only looked at the kind of direct emissions in New Zealand. So we haven't really factored in the emissions from manufacturing these vehicles, you know, overseas. And the question around disposal, I think, is also a really interesting question, which we need to think a bit more about. But on the kind of life cycle emissions, no, we haven't factored that in. We've taken a view on setting the budgets around using production emissions, but the kind of consumption emissions approach is really interesting because you don't want to be seeing yourself kind of by taking action domestically, actually encourage kind of substitution and importing emissions through products rather than kind of creating them here. On the disposal of kind of EVs and the kind of management of that, I think that's really interesting. And I wonder if kind of over the next few years, we're going to get better at dealing with that. And I'm kind of certainly imagining that we'll have better management and recovery of those kind of materials at the end of vehicles' lives. But that technology is moving pretty quickly, but we haven't made any recommendations about it.
Can I just add one thing there, Chris? Just on around the life cycle impacts of EVs, there was a study by ECA a few years ago now that found that on a life cycle basis, that an EV emits about 40% as much as a comparable internal combustion engine vehicle. It's including all the manufacturer emissions. So we have looked at that, and we're confident that comparing an internal combustion engine vehicle to an EV, it's clearly lower emissions, whichever way you look at it. But it does certainly still create some emissions in the manufacturing, and that's one of the reasons why wherever we can sort of reduce our, the reliance on vehicles and the number of vehicles that we need in the country, the better.
Thank you both. That was really great, and thanks for the presentation. We're probably going to have to close off now, but I'm sorry to everyone whose questions we haven't had a chance to answer. I've seen some really good ones coming through. As I said earlier in the session, we do really encourage you to make a submission, and we're really keen to hear from you. So I'll pop the link to the consultation website in the chat in a second. We have been running quite a lot of these sessions, and the recordings are all on our website, so I'll share the link to that in a second as well, and we are posting any upcoming sessions on there if you want to attend a follow-up. And we are also updating our FAQ page on our website really regularly, so have a look at there, and some of your questions may be answered via that. So to round us off, I'm just going to ask Bevan to come back on and see us out with a karakia.
Kia ora tātou, tēnā koutou mua koutou awhina I tuku mai hei tautoko I tā tātou hui me te kaupapa nei. So thank you all for your many views, your questions, the interactions and the time that you've invested in this kaupapa. Anei he karakia whakamutunga. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te ata whai o tō tātou ariki a ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga o te wairua tapu, ake, ake, āmini. Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.